Hello, and welcome to the Thinking Elixir podcast, where we cover the news of the community and learn from each other. My name is Mark Erickson.
And I'm David Bernheisel.
Let's jump into the news.
Hey, so first up, coming soon in Xdoc, so all of your hex docs near you, a new button is going to be appearing on the left side panel near the top where the version drop-down selector is. And that new button is going to serve two purposes in my mind. First, alert you to know visually, little warning symbol, that says you are looking at an older version. But then the button will push you to the latest version's documentation if you only if you happen to be on an earlier version. So I'm excited about that. I don't know why. It's such a simple little thing like that. Just makes things better, right? For whatever inexplicable reason, I will Google a problem. Mm-hmm. I will find a hexdocs.pm link, and for whatever reason, it goes to some super old version of the documentation, and I don't always realize it, or I do think about it too often, and I'm just like, it just ends up being like 3 or 4 more clicks to figure out something. And so, we've got a link to a tweet that kind of illustrates what this is. The PR also has an example there. We got links to all the things so you can actually see what we're talking about. But the short version is, new button that says go to latest in HexDocs on Xdoc. That's your, I suppose this has to be coupled with HexDocs, but maybe not. It'll alert you to know that you're on an older version, and it'll give you a quick way to go to the latest one. So that's fantastic.
I like the visual call out just to help you notice it. Because, oftentimes if you search for it, you're just going off of whatever the Google indexed version was. And hey, a lot of people were clicking on this indexed version, so we're just going to put that higher in the list.
Yeah, and they're personalized too, I think. So, if you've clicked on Elixir 1.12 a lot for some reason, right. I think Google remembers that for you particularly, and it'll just continue to send you to old docs.
What I do appreciate that the old docs are available, though, that you're not always seeing the latest, because if, I'm on this project, I just inherited this project, maybe you're a contractor, right? Picking something up, and it's really old. It's I need to get to the old version of these docs. So I love that it's accessible. But it does create this other problem. All right. And next up, Phoenix Analytics 0.3.0 was released. And I was like, Phoenix Analytics, what is that? I don't think I've heard of that before. So this is an independent project. It's not actually part of the Phoenix project itself. It describes itself as plug and play analytics for Phoenix applications. The big change in this release, this 0.3 release, is an update that makes it easier to use the library on hosts like Fly.io and Heroku by no longer requiring disk persistence. And really, you're like, okay, well, what is it doing with disk persistence? All right, so what's kind of crazy about this, and it's really neat, we've talked about Error Tracker, and we've talked about Tower, where it has, Tower gives you these things that are bringing more what are normally considered external services, bringing those into your Phoenix application and letting you host it yourself. And that's what this one is. You want a dashboard for your server, your application. Well, we can actually host that in Phoenix. So you're getting all of your analytics. Normally, you're having that stuff being exposed by your application. Maybe it's going into a Prometheus cluster or something like that. And then you have Grafana that's showing you all this data that's coming out of it. So this is just saying, hey, we're generating the analytic data. Let's just capture it. And in this one, they're showing how you can actually store that into your Postgres database and then serve and display the dashboard from your application. So now if you're in the enterprise, right, the operations team is going to say, no, this is the stuff we want you to push everything into. It's all centralized. Everything's all one big pool of data that we can cross and slice and everything. It's this is not for that. This is hey, I've got my own small little project, and I'd like to keep it simple. I don't want to have all these additional external services just to run my app and get some visibility into what's going on. So this includes a little route helper so that you can just show my dashboard analytics and provide the URL you want to have that on. I think it's really cool. I haven't tried it yet, but the graphics are pretty. It looks nice. And it's wow, I just love the options of having things like this that I can just put into my application and host myself.
Yeah, this looks really slick. This is very impressive looking. Pretty excited about it. They use DuckDB, by the way, which is pretty cool. They explain in their README, it says they want to do that as a separate storage option because they don't want to interfere with your typical transactional connections that you have going on for your application logic and all the other things in your normal database. So they do try to separate it. And I remember being interested in using DuckDB for other cases before. So anyway, I got to look into it some more. But man, this looks like a really good, really cool option. If you only needed to store the stuff locally, this is a fantastic option. If you just need analytics at all, like this is a fantastic option. It's not like you get the worst version because you have to stay local. You know what I mean? Like this is actually a pretty fantastic option both ways, which is pretty sweet.
Yeah, and it was a new one to me. So I was like, wow, this is really neat. I'm very interested to look further into it.
All right, next up, you probably need a deep dive, maybe, if you're interested, on how set-theoretic types, generally, so I could just stop there, but then also how set-theoretic types are going to be a better type system for libraries. I had to think about this for a second. It's like, for libraries too. Yeah, because there's a lot of like changing things in libraries. When you want to upgrade a library, like how do you... Anyway, so José Valim published an article that explores backwards compatibility, which is particularly important for libraries, right? They want to evolve their data model that the application might have to like work around with the library itself. So that way you can have easy upgrades to newer versions, get those newer things, and then slowly, or at least have the option to slowly upgrade some of your tie-ins with that library. So here's a quote. In particular, we want to provide a mechanism where both the old and new version of a schema can coexist while preserving type safety. End quote there. So the article is going to use like schemas as the primary example, which makes a lot of sense. If you think about the lifespan of your app, your schemas do change over time. We have migrations for them, right? We add new fields for them. And so when you tie that in with type specs, those things need to change as well. Normally, you can just make the change. Now it has the new field everywhere. But when it comes to libraries, we got to have a bit more backwards compatibility. Usually, it's a better DevX, developer experience to have backwards compatibility. And Phoenix in particular is really good about that. To kind of illustrate what the type problems might be here, here's an example. It's not exact, but here's an example that kind of fit in my head. If you have a running app of like 100 nodes and you need to deploy a new version of the app and that adjusts a type in the new version, right? You got 100 nodes out there and the rollout is going to occur over several minutes, right? When it's rolling out, the production app is going to have both versions running at the same time, at least for a little while, a minute or something, or maybe 15 minutes, depending on how many nodes you got out there. So the question becomes what is considered correct at that point when it comes to type safety? So that illustrates the problem, but that particular problem is actually like a runtime problem, whereas type safety is going to be more of a compile time issue and across time as well. To bring it back to like schemas, one way that the developer community has typically handled that, or one option for that, is protobufs. I hate protobufs. I've had to deal with them before. But protobufs do handle this. So for example, if you have 2 or 3 apps and they all have to kind of share a schema, those apps can't really deploy at the same time, right? So one of them is going to be looking at an older version for a little while. And so protobufs is a binary format, I think, that allows it's coupled with gRPC for some odd reason and allows you to communicate your schemas and transfer your schemas over to each of your services. And so in your schema, in the protobuf, one of the limitations of it or requirements of it is as that schema evolves over time, you can add fields to that schema. You can define the types of that, like integer or string and all that kind of stuff. But when you add stuff to it, it has to be at the bottom of that protobuf. And so when protobuf serializes that into binary, the other apps deserializing it, depending on their version of that schema, which is kind of managed by protobuf, but there is a version attached to those, they would deserialize it and basically take what they know about and truncate the rest, right? So an older app using an older version of the protobuf would just only have knowledge, but it would still work. That's the beauty of it. It would still work. but it would not care and not read those other fields on there, right? So that's what protobuf does. So I hate protobuf because it's just this other complicator, in all of infrastructure and all your apps, and it's just the way to do that is, I don't know, it's just too much to me. But it is a system, and essentially as a language, when you think about it at a language level, you have to use something like protobufs because you have to like basically export your types out to this other system, protobuf, let it handle your types, and then protobuf has a bunch of adapters that work for languages and auto-generate a bunch of a mess of code, really. They auto-generate a mess of code to adapt that protobuf into your language again. And then you have, I guess, essentially, you have a bunch of different versions and version handling in that auto-generated code, but it's auto-gened, right? So you can't really edit it, or at least you shouldn't. So it just ends up being a headache, in my opinion. All right, so getting back to the article. So that's kind of like the problem space, right? Protobuf today kind of handles that, but it's not really part of the language. It's just a necessary part of your infrastructure at that point, especially when you have multiple services, or especially if you have multiple services in different languages that need to share schemas or any kind of type.
Right.
So in Elixir, what would that look like? Right? So we're getting set-theoretic types. I always get that mixed up. It's just a phrase. But we're going to get type safety in Elixir somehow, and it has a gradual kind of principle to it, right? Not everything has to be typed right out the box, but it's still sound, right? So go listen to Jose's, conference talks that talk more about that. But how are we going to deal with revisions to type definitions over time without rebuilding protobuf? I guess. So I guess that's the whole point. I won't spoil the whole article. You should go read the article. It really goes into like the problem space a little bit more specifically. I am interpreting with my lens of the world, but other languages with static types don't have revision handling built in. And I'm not saying yet that Elixir will, but that's the point of the article, is exploring this. But Elixir could have revision history tracking on schemas to support type safety, which is just going to be bonkers. Like, there's no other language that has that that I'm aware of. That's crazy talk.
Well, you think about it, it's like, Jose, and because it's coming out of academia, and this is in set-theoretic types, is entirely new and doesn't exist anywhere else. So you've already got like this one whole new concept way of doing types. It's like, hi, why don't we just throw more into that? Like, why don't we just, what if we could do like versioned history over, it's like, wow, it's bonkers. It is. But no one's doing that. And it's still a question of, can it be done? And can it be done in a way that makes sense and is consistent and performant and whatever. But it's just like that you have this ability to explore ideas like that is crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. So he has examples of like mocked up, syntax of how to handle this, but you really got to go look at the article. But just over the podcast for now, for what I can try to communicate, like you can almost imagine like a def module schema. That's the module. And then in there you have def struct, and you list your fields in there. Like today it's kind of a def struct and a list of fields and their types. It could end up being more of a macro. It already is a macro, but it could be more like a macro, feel more like a macro of def struct do, and you put in types in there like name, : as a string. And then here's the new part, is like revision to do. And then you got a block in there that tells you like the newer version of that schema, right? So it's name, : string, or nil, right? So or nil is the new part of the schema. So you've got your older revision and your newer revision of the schema. And then you have in your mix.exs, you can inform the compiler like of those revisions for that particular schema. I could keep on talking about this because this also kind of like reminds me of one of the things I hate about Node of npm packages, because the way that it kind of works there, this is one of the things that I learned about in Elixir. The way that it works in Node is that if three of your packages all depend on the same kind of like package but different versions of the package, Node will bring all three of those versions in, and I don't know what magic it does, but it does something, and you end up with three versions of that library in there, but kind of namespace correctly, I guess, so that way those depending on it would just refer to the correct version, right? But you end up with three copies of essentially of that same like dependent library down all the way down the tree.
Wow.
And then there's, and then there's, anyway, so Mix doesn't do that. It requires you, any library in your whole tree that needs to depend on a library has to be the same copy of the code, the same version of the code. They all have to be much more lockstep. Node doesn't, but I think has its own trade-offs that I didn't appreciate. So if you think about it with schemas, like you could have now multiple schemas in your code. But it's defined and it's explicit for the sake of a better developer experience. And it's really it's not versioning all of your code that handles the schema. It's just versioning the definition of the schema for the purposes of compiling and ensuring type safety. So it's just about type safety here. All right. Anyway, maybe that's enough about that article, but I read that article and I was thinking, oh, this is more information about set theoretic types. They're making more progress. Hip, hip, hooray. And then I read it and I was like, oh, this could have a huge impact on the look and feel of Elixir, which we kind of knew that it could have that. And I feel like this might be the first time we talk about like the look and feel of set theoretic types in Elixir. But anyway, curious of what everyone else thinks about it. It looks like a very smart way of approaching it, and I'm able to understand it because of my experience with protobufs. So I'm able to like understand the problem space here. So it's pretty exciting that of all the set theoretic type stuff, like it's very academic. I don't really follow all of that, but now it's getting into the applicable things in like application code. I'm like, oh yes, I've definitely dealt with that problem. Like this is going to be a pretty cool way if this could be handled.
Yeah, a very simple view of that. It's like something I've run into myself is if I'm storing a structured blob of data like JSON data or something like that, and I'm storing that into my database, I have to you put a version number in there because you could be some time down the road after the schema has changed in code, loading and restoring an old one, then you have to have a migration path of how do I migrate this data blob into a current form. So you can think about that and just like, okay, I that's easy for me to picture. That's a very simple problem. That's just schemas that are stored and persisted. This is like talking about multiple type versions and the compilation process. Yeah, it's just, it starts to appreciate there's a lot more here than I've even begun to think in that direction, right? That's crazy stuff. Well, I'm super excited that it is being considered and I can't wait to see what happens.
Yeah.
All right, and next up, there's a new short Elixir stream video by Germán Velasco that covers the new Elixir 1.18 type system changes. So we're just talking about all the interesting stuff that could be down the road. Well, what just came out was Elixir 1.18, and Germán digs into showing a code sample, a nice, clean, easy to follow code sample. And he shows how Elixir 1.17 does not give a compiler warning. Like it starts off as valid code. You make a code change because that's what we do with our code. And then it becomes invalid. Elixir 1.17 does not catch it. He switches to 1.18 and now it catches it. But he also shows how, hey, just to be aware, if your code is a bit more dynamic, then it won't catch it at compilation time. So it's not 100% this does everything, but I'd say this does most everything. Like most code, this would catch issues. So it's a huge improvement. And I've been very happy with Elixir 1.18. I haven't had any issues, and I've loved the new type improvements.
All right, next up, PragProg has a new book in its roster. This one is about Ash, and it's now in beta. So this new Ash book being published by PragProg is authored by Rebecca Lee, one of the active contributors of Ash, and then Zach Daniel, of course. And the table of contents includes probably what you would expect, but here it is. It's domain modeling and forms, and it's using live views, so it's going to be modern standards, I guess, when it comes to Phoenix. It's going to include authentication and authorization, right? Auth and auth. Both of those are different things, right? Authentication being like the request response cycle to set the session or however you want to do it. But then I feel like the harder part sometimes is actually the other side of it. It's like, okay, now I'm in. Now what can I do? That's the authorization part. Declarative programming in authorization is actually a pretty good fit, in my opinion. So I'm curious to see what that looks like. And the book explains that as well. And then another part that it's going to include is dynamic search. I don't know a good way to put that, but inevitably you're going to come across some form that needs to build an ecto query for searching flexibly, right? And so there's going to be a chapter based on that and how to do that with Ash as well, because you're modeling in Ash. So Ash can help you compose those queries with Ecto and it has integrations with Ecto. Then you go up the layer up to like the APIs, and they have integrations with like REST, JSON APIs, and then GraphQL APIs, which is pretty cool. They got a couple more, and one of the ones that it's not in the beta right now. It is listed in there, I think, is handling things like notifications, more real-time notifications. Think PubSub and Elixir in Phoenix rather. And so how would that look with using Ash? So you can buy that today. That book is in beta right now, but you can buy that today. The final version of this is estimated to release around August of this year, so around 7 months from now. So they've got plenty more to write up there at the tail end of the book. But the beta is out today, and it's on PragProg. I'm sure there's going to be a sale at some point, but it looks like it's going to cover a good amount of topics here to apply and basically teach you like how Ash and like really good scenarios of how Ash is going to be helpful for the day-to-day on for developers.
Yeah, it's a book like that I think really helps. Like if you're interested in Ash and it's like, oh, it sounds interesting, I'd like to understand it better. A book like that helps you walk from first principles up through it, so you're not like just trying to jump into API docs and trying to build a mental model. So something like that can be super helpful. And that's not to say there aren't some great guides on Ash, right? Like there could be incredible resources there, but this is another form, and it has the benefit of an editor and someone else going through it and saying, hey, from this perspective, we need a little bit more explanation here, or we need to simplify this, So that's really cool. That's part of the benefit of things that get put into a book. All right. And next up, do you remember Flame? So it's Chris McCord's library that makes it super simple to dynamically spin up additional hardware resources on something like fly.io. And then you can dynamically perform work on those resources and then return results. So Flame actually stands for Fleeting Lambda Application for Modular Execution. Well, we learned of a new library called Flame EC2. As you might expect, the name kind of just gives it away. It's a library that supports running Flame on AWS EC2 machines. So that sounds pretty cool. Like if that's something you've been wanting to play with, you're already got your application hosted in AWS, you're using EC2 machines, you might want to check this out and see, what could I do now with Flame as a resource with EC2? It just sounds really cool. I hadn't seen it before and I wanted to pass that on.
Pretty excited about that. Like I feel like EC2 is pretty baseline. Anyone that's working with the bare metal version of things, that's like probably a good basis.
EC2 has been around so long. It's just like, hey, I've got a VM and that's it. But hey, VMs can be dynamically allocated and spun up and shut down. So what could we do? I
say bare metal, as we can get, I guess. Not nowadays. Bare containers, I guess. I don't know. All right. Hey, now we're going to go into the conference section of our news updates today. We got two for you. First up is Codebeam Lite. This one is in London in 2025, this current year that you are existing in. It is in January. That's this month. It's in a couple of weeks, Friday, the 31st. Michał Muscala is going to be presenting there. The tickets are currently listed at about £125. Looks like I've always wanted to visit London. This is not going to be my time, though. But if you're looking for a good localized conference and you happen to be in the London area or easy to get to London area, that looks like the place to go. Big, beautiful London.
And just to round that out, we hadn't talked about AlchemyConf in a little while. I just want to put that back on people's radar. It's this April in Braga, Portugal. The first few days are workshops, and then it's like April 2nd and 3rd, I think, are the actual conference part of it with the talks. So the latest update here was on what workshops are being offered. So there are 3 currently where you got these, 3 big names. We got Sasha Yerk leading a workshop on practical testing with Elixir and Phoenix. Zach Daniel, supercharge your Elixir apps with Ash. So that's getting hands-on training, getting up and going with Ash. Andrea Leopardi, concurrent data processing in Elixir. So those are 3 workshops that are being offered with that conference in April, AlchemyConf. So we got links to all those resources as well.
Oh, and one last thing, totally unrelated to everything, and only benefiting those that are looking at the video version of this. I got a new desk toy here. It's not really a toy, I guess. It's about a foot high version of Yoshi from Super Mario World, but in chimera form. I love this thing. It is cutely horrific. So just to describe it, it's Yoshi with 3 heads. You got a mean looking Yoshi, one with his tongue out, a fun Yoshi with wings, and 2 tails with little Yoshi eggs as at the top of the tails. And it's perfect. That's the only way I can describe it. It's perfect. And yeah, that's it. Totally not relevant to anybody, but
that's the funny thing. We are just, in general, we're Elixir geeks, right? All of us in the community, we are computer nerds in some aspect, right? We go super deep on some technical issue, but we have these other interests, and they are so varied and so interesting. And that's what's fun about meeting people in person, in conferences or on online communities around these things. You start to realize, hey, this is like a whole person. They have their own ideas of what else is cool. So yeah, thanks for sharing, David.
It's weird. It's super weird. That's okay. I mean, some of us start conferences called Goatmire. That's super weird, but that's okay.
Oh. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll join us next time on Thinking Elixir.